That day, Sophia stood silently outside the gates of Whispershade Academy, her worn-out shoes caked with mud, and her old jacket could barely shield her from the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She held her breath as Miss Veronica Hale walked past, her cold gaze like a sharp blade. The whole school knew Sophia was poor, but today it was her own teacher who blocked her path. "You can't enter the class looking like this," she said bluntly, her lips tight. Sophia's heart shattered under the weight of the teacher's disdain. Would she ever find a way out, or would she remain trapped in the shadows of poverty forever? Follow Sophia's journey to see if she can overcome this harsh reality and find hope in the most unexpected places. Don't miss the moving journey and the surprising turns of fate ahead. The early morning mist clung to the streets of Whispershade, thick and unyielding, like the fog of uncertainty that hung over the town itself. The sleepy hum of the old town began to stir with the sounds of creaking shutters and the clatter of kitchen pots. In the distance, the towering spire of Whispershade Academy stood as an imposing reminder of the weight of tradition and expectation. The school with its ivy-covered brick walls had been the heart of the community for over a century, yet its pristine exterior concealed cracks beneath cracks of inequality division and broken dreams. Sophia Langley stood at the edge of the sidewalk, clutching her old brown backpack to her chest. The weathered leather straps dug into her small fingers, the rough material, the only thing that seemed solid in her world of uncertainty. Her eyes traced the familiar route to school, but today it felt different. She wasn't just walking to class, she was walking toward a new beginning. Or at least, she hoped it would be. The small tattered shoes on her feet were a reminder of the life she lived, a life held together by frayed seams and fading hopes. Her jacket, handed down from her older brother, had a patch sewn over the sleeve, a badge of poverty she could never shed. She had tried to make it look presentable, careful to wash the stains from the fabric and press out the wrinkles. She'd even polished her shoes with an old rag until they gleamed as best as they could. Today was special. Today was the field trip to the city's Natural History Museum, a rare opportunity for the children of Whispershade Academy to see the world outside their small town. Sophia had dreamed about this trip for weeks, her heart set on the dinosaurs, the gemstones, the vast halls of knowledge that awaited. She had carefully packed her lunch, her notebook, and a pencil, ready to be part of something bigger than herself. She had even stayed up late the night before, reading about the fossils, and imagining herself standing beneath towering skeletons, touching the ancient bones, letting the echoes of history wash over her. But as she walked up the cracked pavement, her excitement began to melt away, replaced by the familiar sting of anticipation, mingled with dread. The gate of Whispershade Academy loomed ahead, a cold, metallic barrier to her dreams. Sophia's heart began to beat faster, but it wasn't from excitement. It was from fear. The fear of being judged, of being rejected, of not belonging. She reached the entrance where a few of her classmates had already gathered, laughing and chatting. Their brightly colored jackets, new backpacks, and pristine shoes reflected a different reality, a reality that Sophia could only glimpse, but never quite enter. She stood to the side, adjusting her bag, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. But it was no use. The whispers had already started. "Look at her shoes," one of the girls said, her voice high and condescending. Sophia's stomach twisted. She knew what they were saying. She could always hear the words in the air before they were spoken aloud. "So old-fashioned," another girl chimed in. "Like a beggar." Sophia lowered her head, her hands trembling, her cheeks flushed with heat, the shame creeping in like an unwelcome shadow. She wasn't invisible after all. No matter how much she tried to blend into the background, no matter how carefully she chose her clothes, and how much she longed to be part of the world they inhabited, she could never escape who she was. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ms. Veronica Hale, the strict and stern teacher, walking toward the gate. Ms. Hale had always been the embodiment of order and discipline at Whispershade Academy, a woman who demanded perfection in every corner of the school. Her sharp eyes seemed to see everything, and nothing ever escaped her scrutiny. Sophia's heart skipped a beat as the teacher's gaze landed on her, freezing her in place. Ms. Hale's lips tightened, and her eyes narrowed, scanning Sophia's outfit with disapproval. The judgment was swift, and it was cruel. Sophia Langley stepped forward, Ms. Hale's voice cut through the air like a blade. Sophia flinched, the sound of her name suddenly feeling like an accusation. She tried to gather her composure, but her legs felt like jelly as she moved toward her teacher. The other students watched, their eyes trained on her like vultures circling a wounded animal. When she reached Ms. Hale, the teacher's eyes traveled up and down her form, the silence stretching between them. It felt like an eternity. "What is this?" Ms. Hale's voice was sharp and full of disdain. "This isn't the proper attire for a field trip, Sophia. You look like you're going to a garage sale, not a museum. You'll only embarrass us with your lack of standards." Sophia's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest as her world seemed to collapse around her. The world she had imagined filled with dinosaurs and history began to shrink, closing in on her as the harsh reality of her teacher's words hit her like a fist. Embarrassment, shame, inferiority. These were the feelings that swirled in her mind, making it impossible to focus on anything else. "You are not going on this trip," Ms. Hale continued, her voice unwavering. "Not until you learn what it means to have some pride." The words were like a cold slap, and Sophia's face flushed with humiliation. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to argue, to explain that she had done her best, that she had prepared for this moment like any other child, but the lump in her throat prevented her from speaking. Instead, she stood there in stunned silence, trying to hold back the tears that burned in her eyes. Around her, the murmurs of her classmates grew louder. Some were laughing, others were whispering. The embarrassment spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Sophia was no longer a child eager for adventure. She was now the object of ridicule, the symbol of what happened when you didn't belong. Ms. Hale's gaze never softened. "Go back to the classroom. We don't have time for distractions." With a dismissive wave, she turned her attention back to the rest of the students, signaling them to proceed to the bus. Sophia's legs shook as she walked away from the gate. Her heart was heavy, her head spinning with the shame of being singled out, humiliated in front of everyone. She had been so close to experiencing something amazing, something that could have changed her life, expanded her world. But now that dream was shattered, lost forever behind the iron gates of Whispershade Academy. As she walked through the hallways of the school, she could hear the faint sounds of the other children gathering in line for the bus. The laughter, the excitement, but all of it felt like it was happening in a world that wasn't hers. A world that she could never reach, no matter how hard she tried. She stopped in front of the classroom door, staring at the cracked wooden frame as her fingers brushed the worn edges of the handle. Her fingers felt numb, the weight of Ms. Hale's words still pressed down on her chest. She was alone now in a place where her dreams couldn't survive. But then something changed. In the distance, she saw a figure approaching, a man dressed in a crisp suit, his eyes focused on her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Jonathan Wright, the businessman who had grown up in Whispershade, had returned to his hometown to give back. The man had been a symbol of success for years, but today, his attention was on her. Timmy's heart beat faster. Could he help? Could he see her? The answer would come soon, But in that moment, it wasn't just about the field trip. It was about a bridge being built from this broken moment to a future where dreams weren't bound by the weight of judgment. And that bridge was about to be built one step at a time. The schoolyard felt smaller now, almost suffocating. Every step Sophia took toward the classroom seemed to echo louder than the last, the crushing weight of her embarrassment amplifying with each passing second. Her shoes, the very ones that had earned her humiliation, now felt heavier than ever, as if they carried the weight of her shame on their souls. She wanted to run far away from the laughter, the whispers, the feeling of being less than everyone else. But her legs betrayed her, dragging her forward into the cold, sterile space of the classroom that felt more like a prison than a place of learning. Inside the classroom was already bustling with activity. The desks arranged in neat rows were filled with children chattering about the museum, their voices bubbling with excitement. It should have been a time for Sophia to join in, to share her eagerness for the trip. But the very thought of it only reminded her of the cruel words Ms. Hale had thrown at her. The teacher's sharp tone still reverberated in her ears. "You look like a beggar." The words were seared into her mind, and every time she thought about them, they burned her from the inside out. Sophia slid into her desk, trying to shrink into the smallest version of herself. She hoped no one would notice her, hoped that she could become invisible. But it was impossible. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, their glances filled with curiosity and pity. Kevin, the boy who always sat next to her, looked over at her with a hesitant expression. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, unsure of what to say. Sophia felt his hesitation like a blade twisting in her side. It was a reminder of how she was different, how she never quite fit in, even when she so desperately wanted to. The bell rang, cutting through the tense silence, and the teacher, Ms. Hale, strode into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. She was a woman of precision, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression a mask of professionalism that barely concealed her underlying coldness. She glanced over the class, her eyes scanning the students one by one, taking in their appearances with a practiced eye. She said nothing about the field trip. Instead, she began her usual drill, the routine that everyone had come to expect. Sophia barely heard her words, her mind still reeling from the earlier exchange. Every time she tried to focus, her eyes would flicker to the empty seat in front of her, Kevin's seat, where he should have been sitting beside her, ready to go on the field trip. But Kevin was nowhere to be found, and the empty desk beside her seemed to amplify the growing knot in her stomach. The minutes stretched on like hours. The hum of the classroom felt distant, as if Sophia were suspended in time, far away from the world outside. But eventually the bell rang again, signaling the end of the day's lesson. The children eagerly packed their bags, ready to leave for the trip, but Sophia remained seated, her hands gripping the edges of her desk, as if they were the only things keeping her from falling into the abyss. She couldn't bring herself to move. Her backpack, which she had packed with care the night before, felt like a burden now, too heavy, too much. The weight of the lunch she had packed with love, the pencil case she had borrowed from her grandmother, and the permission slip she had carefully filled out and signed, all seemed to mock her now. The trip was slipping through her fingers like sand falling through an open hand. Ms. Hale walked past her desk, a clipboard in her hand, ticking off names from a list of students attending the field trip. When she reached Sophia's desk, her eyes narrowed. "Sophia, you're not going, are you?" She asked, her voice colder than it had been earlier that morning. The words were soft, but they cut through the air like glass shattering. Sophia's heart clenched, and she could feel the tears pricking at her eyes again, but she refused to let them fall. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Ms. Hale's expression softened for just a moment, But it was not the sympathy Sophia had hoped for. It was the faintest trace of condescension. "If you want to be taken seriously, you need to dress the part." Ms. Hale said this as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if it were an undeniable truth. You can't expect to be treated like everyone else if you don't put in the effort. And with that, she moved on to the next student, leaving Sophia in her wake alone and invisible once more. The classroom, which had seemed so full of life only moments before, now felt silent and hollow, the vibrant chatter of her classmates distant and unimportant. It was as if everything had shifted, and now the focus was on Sophia and her failure to meet some arbitrary standard of acceptance. She was no longer a part of the group. She was the outcast. She wasn't even allowed to be a part of the day's adventure, the one thing she had looked forward to with all her heart. When the bell finally rang, the students rushed out heading toward the buses, eager to leave the confines of the classroom behind and step into the excitement of the field trip. Sophia watched them all go, her heart heavy with defeat. She wanted to leave, too, wanted to escape the weight of the school, the weight of the world pressing down on her small shoulders. But she couldn't move. Instead, she sat there, her fingers curled into fists, as she listened to the bus engines starting up one by one. She could hear them pulling out of the parking lot, the engines growling, the sound of a world moving on without her. It was in that moment that something inside Sophia snapped. The frustration, the humiliation, the deep-rooted feeling that she would never be good enough for this world, it all came to a head. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't sit there any longer drowning in her shame. She bolted out of the classroom, her footsteps quick and erratic, as if she were running from something, or perhaps toward something, anything. The halls were deserted now, the classrooms empty as the field trip children filled the buses. She made her way toward the back door, the one that led out to the schoolyard, the one that was never used by anyone except for the stragglers. As she pushed the door open, the cold air hit her face, and she stepped outside, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the buses pulling away in the distance, their taillights fading into the horizon. For a moment she felt like she might collapse, as if the ground beneath her feet would give way. She wanted to scream, to yell at the injustice at the world that had allowed this to happen to her. But all that came out was a soft, broken sob, the sound so small it seemed to disappear the moment it left her lips. Suddenly she felt a presence beside her. A figure stood in the doorway, watching her with concern in his eyes. Jonathan Wright, the millionaire businessman, had arrived. He had been watching the entire scene from a distance, and now he stepped closer, his footsteps quiet against the worn tiles. He crouched down to her level, his gaze steady, warm, and filled with an understanding that caught Sophia off guard. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was calm, gentle, as if he were speaking to someone far older than her. But it was the kindness in his eyes that made her stop, made her heart slow just a little. She looked up at him, her face flushed from crying, her hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to explain the pain that consumed her. But Jonathan didn't ask her to speak. He just knelt beside her, offering her his silent understanding. After a long pause, he spoke again, this time with more conviction, his voice carrying a softness that made Sophia feel seen for the first time in a long time. "You deserve better than this." His words were like a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a storm. "And I'm here to make sure you get it." Sophia's chest tightened, and for the first time that day, a flicker of hope ignited in her heart. Maybe things could be different. Maybe this man would be the key to unlocking the world she had always dreamed of. Sophia could still feel the sting of Ms. Hale's harsh words echoing in her mind, but for the first time there was a sense of something else, too, something powerful and unexpected. The small flicker of hope Jonathan Wright had ignited within her heart grew slowly, like the first light of dawn creeping through the cracks of a long, dark night. Jonathan's presence beside her was a lifeline, something Sophia hadn't even realized she desperately needed. She had always assumed that the pain, the isolation, the sense of being an outsider was something she would have to endure alone. But Jonathan had stepped into that silence with an unspoken promise that perhaps she didn't have to face this battle by herself. As Jonathan stood beside her, Sophia tried to wipe away the last traces of her tears, but her hands were shaking, and the tremor in her fingers was far more than just the physical manifestation of emotion. It was the exhaustion of years spent in a world that hadn't given her a fair chance, a world where everything she did was measured against a standard that she could never reach. She looked up at Jonathan, feeling a swell of gratitude that was too big for words. He met her gaze with a quiet understanding, one that made her feel for the first time that day like she wasn't invisible. Not just a poor girl standing outside the gates of a school, but someone worthy of attention, compassion, and action. What happened today wasn't right, Sophia, Jonathan said gently, his voice smooth but firm, like a steady hand placed on her shoulder. You shouldn't have to feel ashamed of who you are or where you come from. His words were simple, but they held a weight that made her feel as if something inside her was shifting, something that had been stuck for years, an unspoken belief that she wasn't enough, that she would never be enough. But Jonathan's voice cut through that murky fog like a blade through thick cloth, and for a moment she could almost believe it, that she could be more, that she could rise above it all. Jonathan paused for a moment, letting the silence settle around them before speaking again, this time with a hint of resolve in his tone. I know what it's like to be looked down on for things you can't control. His words hit Sophia with the force of a memory, and she looked up at him surprised. She had always seen Jonathan as a successful businessman, someone who seemed to have it all: money, power, influence. She had never thought of him as someone who might have ever known what it felt like to be dismissed or ridiculed. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else, something that softened his usually confident exterior. A glimpse of vulnerability. I wasn't always rich, you know, Jonathan continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were revealing something deeply personal. I grew up in a small town just like this. I wore clothes like yours, Sophia. I was looked down upon for being different. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she felt like he truly understood. People never looked past my clothes, my background. They saw me as less. Jonathan paused, almost as if he was weighing his next words. But I'm here to tell you that you're more than your circumstances. You're more than what people see on the outside. Sophia blinked rapidly, the weight of his words sinking in. She felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. But her mind was racing, trying to process what he had said. Jonathan wasn't just offering her sympathy. He was offering her a chance to believe that the world she had been stuck in, the world of judgment and rejection, wasn't the only one available to her. He was telling her that she had a choice. The realization settled slowly in her chest, like the warmth of sunlight on a cold morning, and she could feel it, the slow, steady hum of possibility. I can't let this go, Jonathan said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. What happened today, it's not just your problem, Sophia. It's a problem for everyone in this town, and we need to do something about it. He spoke with such confidence that Sophia almost felt as though he were already taking action, like he had a plan, a way forward. But even more than that, she felt something inside her stir, a quiet hope that maybe she could be a part of that plan, a part of something bigger than herself. Sophia nodded, a slow but sure gesture, her heart still racing, but now with something new, something different, an urge to move forward, to take the next step. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, or even what would come next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to be silent anymore. She wouldn't stand idly by while people like her were pushed aside. Jonathan was giving her something she hadn't known she needed: a voice. Jonathan smiled at her, a small but genuine smile. "I'm going to make sure you don't have to go through this again." His words were a promise, and Sophia felt something stir in her, something that made her believe him. "And it's not just about you, Sophia. It's about every child who's ever been made to feel like they weren't good enough. We need to make sure that no child here feels the way you felt today." That was when the idea came to him. The Hope Sprouts Fund. Jonathan had been thinking about it for some time, but it was in that moment, standing beside Sophia in the shadow of Whispershade Academy, that it took shape. He would start a fund, a community-driven initiative, to help the children who couldn't afford the things they needed to succeed in school. The fund would provide uniforms, school supplies, transportation, and even scholarships for those who needed them most. But it wasn't just about the material needs. It was about showing the children of Whispershade that they mattered. Jonathan turned to Sophia, his eyes glowing with conviction. "I'm going to start something today, something that will change this town for good. And I want you to be a part of it." Sophia looked up at him, stunned. She had always seen herself as small, insignificant a girl with nothing to offer. But here was Jonathan, a man of means and influence, offering her a place by his side in this endeavor. For the first time, Sophia felt like she had a purpose, something beyond just surviving in the margins of her world. She didn't need to be a bystander anymore. She could take action. "I'll do whatever I can," Sophia said, her voice shaky, but filled with a new sense of determination. And that's when the real change began. Jonathan took it upon himself to reach out to the community. He started talking to the town's leaders, business owners, and philanthropists. He spoke passionately about the need for compassion and equal opportunity for every child in Whispershade. As he began to gather support, the town's atmosphere started to shift. People began to listen, and for the first time in a long while, Whispershade began to feel like a community united by a common goal: to give every child a chance. Sophia's role in all of this was just beginning. She became the voice of the children in need. She spoke at town meetings, telling her story, her truth, and the truth of so many others who were quietly suffering. She had never imagined that her own pain could be the catalyst for something this powerful, but there it was. And the more she spoke, the more people listened. The Hope Sprouts Fund gained momentum, growing into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. And as the town rallied behind the cause, a new energy filled the air, the energy of change. Sophia Langley, once a girl who felt invisible, was now at the heart of a movement that was transforming not just Whispershade, but the future of every child in it. And it was all thanks to the intervention of a man who had once been where she was, someone who understood the quiet power of empathy and the extraordinary potential of even the smallest voices. The days that followed felt like an unstoppable cascade of change, each one adding weight to the growing momentum of the Hope Sprouts Fund. What had started as a quiet, almost secret conversation between Jonathan Wright and Sophia Langley began to echo through the streets of Whispershade, reverberating into the homes of families who had lived under the shadow of inequality for far too long. The community, once fractured by economic divides, was coming together, and there was something undeniably powerful about it, a sense that change was no longer a dream, but a tangible possibility. Jonathan worked tirelessly, reaching out to local businesses, school administrators, and philanthropic organizations to rally behind the cause. What began as an initiative to provide uniforms, school supplies, and transportation for children who could not afford it quickly grew into something far greater. He called a community meeting to formally announce the Hope Sprouts Fund, and on the day of the meeting the small town hall of Whisper Shade Academy was filled to capacity with the town's residents, men and women who had barely spoken to one another before filling every seat in the room, some even standing at the back, eager to hear what was about to unfold. It was the first time in years that the community had been united by anything more than the mundane routines of everyday life. And as Sophia stood beside Jonathan at the front of the room, her heart pounded in her chest. Her eyes scanning the crowd, she felt an electric charge, a quiet sense of purpose that came from knowing that she was part of something bigger than herself. As Jonathan took the stage, his presence commanding but calm, the room fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with anticipation. He smiled at the crowd, and for a brief moment it almost felt like time had stopped, like the world was holding its breath in unison, waiting for the first words to be spoken. Jonathan didn't waste time. He went straight into it, his voice smooth and deliberate. "We are here today because of the children who need us." His words echoed in the quiet hall. "We are here because too many kids in this town are being left behind, not because of their potential, but because of their circumstances." Sophia felt the weight of those words in her chest, and for the first time she truly understood the magnitude of what Jonathan was doing. This wasn't just about providing school supplies or uniforms. It was about creating a community that recognized the worth of every child, no matter where they came from, no matter how much money their parents had in their pockets. And in that moment, Sophia realized that it wasn't just the children of Whispershade who needed the Hope Sprouts Fund. It was the entire town. Jonathan spoke with clarity, with purpose. The Hope Sprouts Fund is not just about what children wear. It's about ensuring that every child in this town can learn, can grow, can chase their dreams, without the fear of being judged by their appearance or their financial status. It's about giving them the tools to build a better future. Sophia's heart swelled as she looked around the room, seeing people nodding, some even wiping away tears moved by Jonathan's words. For the first time in a long while, she saw hope in the eyes of the people around her, and it was a kind of hope she hadn't expected. It was the kind of hope that wasn't just built on dreams, but on tangible action. But as Jonathan continued, the room shifted. Sophia's eyes were drawn to a figure standing near the back of the room, Ms. Veronica Hale. The same woman who had humiliated her just days ago, the one who had single-handedly crushed Sophia's spirit with her cruel words. Ms. Hale's presence in the room was like a weight pressing down on the atmosphere, and it was impossible to ignore the tension that followed her. Her eyes were hard and cold, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if guarding herself against the ideas Jonathan was presenting. She had not come to listen or learn, she had come to protect her pride, her authority, the very system that had upheld her rigid standards for so long. Jonathan finished speaking his final words, ringing with quiet strength. "It's time to open the doors of opportunity for every child here in Whispershade." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sophia felt something shift inside her. Something was about to change, and it wouldn't be without resistance. The people of Whispershade were ready for this transformation, but not everyone was on board. As the crowd began to disperse, the townspeople's conversations grew louder, filled with excitement and speculation about how the fund would change the lives of their children. But as Sophia and Jonathan made their way toward the exit, Ms. Hale approached them, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, each step seemingly deliberate. She stopped in front of Jonathan, her posture stiff and unyielding. "I don't agree with your initiative, Mr. Wright." Her voice was cold, cutting through the air like a knife. "What you're doing is encouraging mediocrity." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she saw Ms. Hale's icy demeanor. She had expected resistance, but there was something so final about her tone, something that made Sophia's stomach twist with anxiety. She could already feel the battle lines being drawn, and she knew this was just the beginning. Jonathan didn't flinch. "What we're doing here is giving every child the chance to succeed, Ms. Hale, regardless of the clothes on their back." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the determination in it. "We're not teaching them to be mediocre. We're teaching them that their potential isn't defined by their circumstances. And I'll make sure that this town knows that." "Ms." Hale scoffed a bitter laugh, escaping her lips. "You'll ruin this town, Mr. Wright. Mark my words." Her eyes flashed with something dangerous, pride, anger, or perhaps a mix of both. But Jonathan met her gaze without hesitation. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen." Jonathan's voice was low but filled with resolve. "I'm not backing down, and neither should you." There was a long silence between them, as if the weight of their words were hanging in the air. Miss Hale stood frozen, the shock of being challenged so openly, so publicly stinging her pride. Finally, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Jonathan and Sophia standing together. Sophia looked up at Jonathan, her eyes wide, but there was a small flicker of something new in them, a quiet pride. Jonathan had stood his ground. He had fought for something that was bigger than all of them. And for the first time in a long while, Sophia felt like she could stand tall, too. She didn't have to shrink away from the world. She could be a part of it, and she could help shape it into something better. The conflict wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. Ms. Hale's resistance was a sign of how deep the inequality ran, but it was also a sign of how much change was possible. Jonathan and Sophia had taken the first step. The Hope Sprouts Fund was more than just an initiative. It was a challenge to the status quo, a challenge that would shake the very foundations of Whisper Shade. As they left the meeting, the weight of the moment settled in. Jonathan and Sophia were no longer just people caught in the gears of the system. They were the change-makers, the ones who would transform the way Whisper Shade saw itself. And despite the resistance they would undoubtedly face, Sophia knew deep down that they couldn't be stopped. Not now. Not ever. The transformation had begun. And this time, it wasn't just the town that would change, it was everyone in it. The days that followed the public confrontation at the town hall meeting felt both exhausting and exhilarating, as if a tidal wave of change was rolling through Whisper Shade, and nothing could stop it. Jonathan and Sophia, though still weary from the battle they had just fought, began to see the results of their efforts slowly take shape. The first official meeting for the Hope Sprouts Fund took place just a week after the announcement, and the turnout was overwhelming. What had started as a passionate plea for equality and opportunity had become a living, breathing movement. Parents, teachers, and even some of the town's wealthiest residents, people who had once turned a blind eye to the town's economic disparities, were now stepping up eager to be a part of the solution. Jonathan and Sophia's vision was no longer a dream. It was a reality that was unfolding before them one step at a time. At the heart of it all was the town's collective desire to right the wrongs that had been so deeply embedded in its culture. No longer would a child like Sophia Langley have to hide her worn shoes, her patchwork clothes, or her poverty. The Hope Sprouts Fund would ensure that every child in Whisper Shade, regardless of their background, would have the chance to succeed, to dream, and to grow without being judged for the clothes they wore or the money their parents had or didn't have. But while things were moving forward, the road ahead was far from smooth. Resistance still lingered in the corners of Whisper Shade, particularly from Ms. Veronica Hale, whose objections to the initiative had only grown more vocal after her defeat in front of the community. The quiet resentment in her eyes, which had been so apparent during their last interaction, had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. She saw the Hope Sprouts Fund as a threat not just to the way she taught, but to the very system of power that had allowed her to maintain control for so long. Ms. Hale was the embodiment of tradition, of old ways of thinking that placed importance on discipline order and conformity. In her mind, Jonathan and Sophia's actions were a direct challenge to the established hierarchy, and she would not let them succeed. Over the next few weeks, whispers began to circulate, fueled by Ms. Hale's steady influence. She spoke to anyone who would listen about the dangers of lowering the standards for children, arguing that the Hope Sprouts Fund was nothing more than a way to coddle them, to let them grow up without the discipline and resilience they needed to face the real world. She called the program softening the children, making them too reliant on charity, too dependent on handouts. To her, it was a moral decay that threatened the future of Whispershade, and she wouldn't stand by and watch it happen. But despite her best efforts, the fund continued to gain momentum. The donations poured in, the volunteers flooded in to help organize the distribution of supplies, and the town's schools began to change. Whispershade Academy, once a place where children like Sophia had been invisible, became a beacon of inclusivity. Teachers began to focus on what their students could accomplish, not on what they lacked. It wasn't just about the clothes they wore, it was about the knowledge they had, the ideas they shared, the potential that was waiting to be unlocked. The Hope Sprouts Fund began to change the narrative of the town, turning it into a place where every child had a chance, no matter their circumstances. And as for Sophia, she found herself growing in ways she had never imagined. She became a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of resilience and hope for the children who had been overlooked by society. She was no longer the shy, self-conscious girl who had been humiliated at the school gate. She was a force to be reckoned with, her confidence building with each passing day as she took on a leadership role within the fund. She began speaking at town meetings, advocating for the children who needed the most help, and sharing her story with anyone who would listen. People started to notice her, not just as a girl from a poor family, but as a young woman who had the power to shape her own future. Sophia had found her voice, and with it she began to help others find theirs. Her relationship with Jonathan deepened as well. He became more than just a mentor. He was someone she could rely on, someone who believed in her potential, even when she couldn't see it herself. He never saw her as just a poor girl from Whispershade. He saw the fire in her eyes, the passion she had for creating change, and he supported her every step of the way. Together they built the Hope Sprouts Fund into something bigger than either of them. It was a movement, one that reached far beyond the walls of Whispershade, inspiring nearby towns to start their own initiatives for children in need. The impact of the fund began to spread beyond the town as well. The media took notice of the small town that had taken matters into its own hands, and soon the story of the Hope Sprouts Fund was picked up by larger news outlets. Jonathan and Sophia were interviewed, their story becoming a symbol of what could happen when a community came together to lift each other up. Donations from around the country began to flood in, and with that money, the Hope Sprouts Fund was able to expand its mission. It began to provide scholarships to deserving students, send children on educational trips, and offer job training to those who needed it most. What started as a small initiative to help children with school supplies had become a national movement for change, and it was all thanks to the vision of two unlikely allies, Jonathan Wright and Sophia Langley. But even as the fund flourished, the shadows of resistance lingered. Ms. Hale's objections grew louder and more aggressive. She started organizing protests, rallying those in town who shared her belief that the Hope Sprouts Fund was undermining the very fabric of Whispershade's society. She criticized Jonathan and Sophia in the local newspaper, accusing them of fostering laziness and entitlement. Her attacks became more personal, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the tension between her and Jonathan would reach a breaking point. Then, one evening after a particularly heated town council meeting, Sophia found herself face to face with Ms. Hale once again. The older woman's eyes were filled with a mix of disdain and something deeper, something that hinted at vulnerability. "You think you've changed everything, don't you?" Ms. Hale asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "You think you've made things better for the children here, but you're just giving them the tools to fail." Sophia stood tall, her back straight, as she met Ms. Hale's gaze. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of shame. Instead, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. "I think we've given them a chance to succeed. Whether they succeed or fail, that's on them. But at least we've given them the opportunity to try." Ms. Hale's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, and for a second, it seemed like she might say something else. But instead she turned away, her shoulders slumped in resignation. It was the beginning of her own transformation, though it would take time. Perhaps in time she would come to see the importance of what Jonathan and Sophia had created. As the year drew to a close, Sophia stood outside Whispershade Academy on the last day of school, watching the children rush out with their backpacks and dreams. The Hope Sprouts Fund had achieved more than she had ever imagined. The classrooms were brighter, the hallways filled with laughter, and for the first time in a long while, Whispershade felt like a place of opportunity for everyone. The work was far from done, but Sophia knew that it didn't matter. The doors had been opened, and there was no going back. Jonathan stood beside her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. "You did it, Sophia." She smiled, the weight of the journey they had taken together settling comfortably in her chest. "No, we did it." And with that, she knew that the future was brighter than ever for Whispershade, for herself, and for every child who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The story of the Hope Sprouts Fund wasn't just about charity, it was about empowerment. It was about giving every child the chance to grow, to dream, and to succeed. The story of Sophia Langley and Jonathan Wright is a profound reminder of the power of empathy, community, and standing up for what is right, even when the path seems uncertain. One of the most important lessons we can learn from their journey is that change starts with a single action, and that action, no matter how small, has the potential to ripple out and impact an entire community. Sophia's transformation from a quiet, humiliated girl to a voice for those who had been overlooked demonstrates the incredible power of self-belief and the importance of being seen. Jonathan's role in helping her find her voice shows us the significance of mentorship. But more importantly, it highlights the responsibility we all have in creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Whether it's standing up for someone who is being unfairly treated, offering a hand to help someone rise, or speaking out when we see injustice, our actions matter. Another key takeaway from this story is the idea of inclusive change. True progress isn't just about fixing problems for a select few, but about creating systems where everyone is given an equal chance to thrive. The Hope Sprouts Fund wasn't just about giving supplies. It was about addressing the deeper issues of inequality and discrimination that so many children face daily. By shifting the narrative from judgment to opportunity, the entire town of Whispershade was transformed. It wasn't a quick fix. It was a long-term commitment to providing resources, changing mindsets, and empowering individuals. The story encourages us to ask ourselves, what systems are we a part of that need to be re-examined? What small actions can we take today to make a difference tomorrow? These questions are at the heart of creating lasting change, both in our communities and in the world at large. Additionally, the story of Ms. Hale's transformation reminds us that even those who resist change can, over time, be affected by it. Understanding and compassion can break down even the most stubborn walls. It also teaches us that change isn't always linear. There will be setbacks, opposition, and moments of doubt. But by staying true to our purpose and listening to others, we can slowly move the needle in the right direction. We should be prepared for challenges, but also keep in mind that progress often comes in unexpected ways, often from places we least expect. As you reflect on this story, I encourage you to consider the ways you can contribute to positive change, both in your personal life and in your broader community. What is one small action you can take today to help someone else feel seen, heard, and supported? Whether it's reaching out to someone who is struggling, challenging an injustice, or starting a community initiative of your own, remember that every action counts. We all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small our steps may seem. Thank you for joining me in this reflection on the power of change, empathy, and community. I hope this story has inspired you to think differently about the impact you can have on the world around you. If you've learned something from Sophia and Jonathan's journey, I would love to hear your thoughts. How have you been inspired to make a positive change? What actions are you planning to take moving forward? Please feel free to share your thoughts and reflections. I look forward to hearing from you and continuing this conversation.